Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Lunch with a Scientist. My name is Leah with Headwaters Science Institute, and today we're going to get to meet another brilliant scientist and learn about his work. We are going to meet hydrologist David Shaw. And so before I tell you about David and his really long career in geology and hydrology and his brilliant work, I want to tell you about a couple exciting events that are coming up with Headwaters. First off, we all know that Halloween is coming up and we wanted to do something fun and sciencey. So if you have young children, we're going to be offering video science activities the week of October 26th through 30th. Please feel free to tune in. One of them will be live, the other two will be recorded. They're fun activities you can do from home to get you excited about the holiday, but also engaged in science. And the other thing that we are really excited to announce is a free screening of the documentary film Picture a Scientist from November 5th through 7th. It's a 48-hour period where we're offering a free screening. All you have to do is register for a ticket and we will email you the link. It's a very powerful documentary film about gender equality in science, and it's a great conversation to be having with your students or your family at home. So please feel free to sign up. The direct short link to sign up is bit.ly/HSI-sciencefilm. So that's bit.ly/HSI-sciencefilm. And so now, without further ado, I am really excited to bring on David Shaw. Hi, David. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Great. We're so excited. So David has over 21 years of experience. He worked with Balance and is the CEO and president of the company. Shortly after completing his Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Geology, he joined the company and took over responsibility for a number of field monitoring and watershed assessment efforts. Over the years, he's led site investigations, watershed assessments, the design and implementation of numerous fluvial, floodplain, and wetland restoration and mitigation projects throughout California and the Sierras in a range of different environments. And we are so excited to hear more about his work. So David, I will let you take it away.
Thanks, Leah. Great. So it looks like you've pulled up my presentation here. And what I thought I would talk about with you all is some work that I've been doing up here near Truckee, California in the Sierra, in the Little Truckee River watershed. And I've spent about 10 years monitoring the effectiveness of a meadow restoration project. The project was carried out by the Truckee River Watershed Council, which is a nonprofit watershed stewardship group here in Truckee. And they worked with the Forest Service to try to restore Piezometer meadows. And when they finished, right around the time they were doing the restoration project, they hired Balance Hydrologics, my company, to do some monitoring to evaluate whether the work that they were doing was effective. So I will tell you guys about that and how we approach that. First, I'll just talk to you about the project a little bit, what they did, what their goals and objectives were, and I'll talk about the monitoring approach that we took. And really specifically, we were charged with looking at changes in stream flow and groundwater conditions that may have resulted from restoring this huge meadow. And then I'll talk about some of the things we learned along the way. And I will, I'll just kind of roll through some of that. So first, I want to tell you where this project is. This is the Little Truckee River watershed. So if you can see my mouse here, this is the headwaters of the Little Truckee, and this is the Sierra crest up in the headwaters. And the Little Truckee River flows through the upper Piezo Meadow, middle Piezo Meadow, and lower Piezo Meadow, and then down into Stampede Reservoir, into Boca Reservoir, and ultimately into the Truckee River, which flows off into Nevada through Reno and off to Pyramid Lake. Here's an aerial shot of the upper and middle meadow. And this is a similar shot to the one I showed on the cover. And it shows the old channel that was plugged up as part of the restoration project. And I'll talk more about that. And then the middle meadow off in the distance there. So there were a number of objectives with the meadow restoration project. They wanted to reestablish floodplain function. The meadow had been degraded. The channel was eroded, and they wanted to fix that. They wanted to get the channel flooding the floodplain more often and get some of that hydrologic function back. And in doing so, they wanted to improve the water quality, because the more the water flows out on the floodplain versus just along the channel, the more it can be filtered out by the plants. The plants can take up nutrients and filter out sediment. The main thing that I was charged with evaluating was whether they were effective in achieving the objective of increasing groundwater storage. So by getting the water out onto the floodplain, were they in fact causing more water to be held in the ground, which then becomes available to plants on the meadow surface and available to flow in the creek further into the summer. And then just generally, they wanted to increase habitat, wetland ecosystem conditions. Part of the driver behind this was that there had been some work carried out by other folks who said, if we restore all the meadows in the Sierra that have been damaged by years and years of deforestation and grazing, and all, a lot of these meadows that have been eroded, if we restore those and we can hold more water in the meadows, we may be able to actually hold as much water as could be stored in, say, building a new reservoir or building a new dam and holding back a reservoir. So that was sort of the impetus behind this project and behind us trying to evaluate the question of, is there more water stored in the soil as a result of doing these restoration projects? So the monitoring approach that we took on was to, in concert with photo documentation, to install shallow piezometers, which are basically just pipes in the ground measuring groundwater levels before and after the project was implemented. And then we also measured stream flow into and out of the meadows at a number of stream flow gauging stations. I'll tell you a little bit about how that works. So here's a map of the upper meadow. Each one of these orange rectangles represents an earthen plug, or basically a dirt fill that they put into the eroded channel. So the existing channel before the restoration followed this light blue and orange path across the meadow, and that was eroded. That was the eroded gully through the meadow. And what they wanted to do was block that gully up and force the water back into these old channels that were still there on the landscape, but didn't get water as frequently as they used to. And so they wanted to basically dam the channel up and kick the water out into these old channels and re-wet more of the meadow. And this was their plan. Some people call this a plug and pond restoration approach. Each one of these orange dams is a plug, and they generate the material by creating ponds on the banks, and the dams create these ponds along the channel and before the water kicks out into the old channels. And this is a map of the middle meadow, same type of approach. Many more channels that they had identified, abandoned channels that they had identified that they could kick water into, but the same type of approach, the plug and pond. And again, this is what that looks like right after they implement it. So in each one of those orange rectangles, they put fill into the channel, create these ponds, and the idea then is to kick water out into these old relict channels that you can see out on the landscape that are still there, but not as functional as they used to be. So here's another view of one of the that eroded channel. So if you think about how the Relic Channel system used to be this diffuse network of a bunch of different shallow channels with water everywhere across the floodplain, this is what it looked like after 100 years of disturbance on the landscape. Ranchers and dairy farmers out there, logging operations. In some cases, they just dug ditches straight across the meadow. They didn't want it so wet that their sheep couldn't graze it, or in some cases, they were using it to float logs down during the intensive logging days. And so what was left over sort of looked like a nice pristine meadow, but the channel was about 4 feet lower than all those other. The main channel was about 4 feet lower than all those remnant channels that had been abandoned. So right after the plug and pond project, you see they were pretty effective in creating those ponds, and you can also see that the some of these relics channels off to the side then became occupied. So again, this is like right after they did the project, and this was done in 2010, and we've been monitoring it for about 10 years now. And towards the end of this talk, I'll show you some photos of what it looks like now. But what I'll talk about, is some of the things we noticed right away after implementing this project. After they implemented this project, another thing that I think is kind of just sort of funny is that I said they hired Balance. I've got a specialized degree in geology and hydrology. They hired us to do this intensive monitoring program, but really, and the question being is, does the groundwater level come up after they do this project? And really, you don't need a specialized degree to look at a picture like this from a nice vantage point and see that, it looks like the water level came up. So just basic observation. But of course, people are putting a lot of money into these projects to do them, and they want to have some documentation and be able to quantify the changes with some numbers. So that's why they do bring us in. So again, just some images for you to see on the ground. What does this look like? On the top photo here, you see the channel prior to being restored, and that same view of the channel after being restored. So again, looks like the water is coming up closer into the root zone to support that vegetation. When the floods come through, it will flow out across the meadow. So how to quantify? Back to the piezometers, fancy word for shallow monitoring wells. They basically measure the pressure of the water, and it basically consists of a 1¼ inch galvanized steel pipe that has holes in the bottom of it, and we just pound that pipe into the ground and about 5 or 8 feet deep. In this case, however deep we could get it. And then the water comes into the pipe in the ground and rises to the level that it is in the surrounding soil, and that tells us where the water table is at and what the groundwater is doing. And in this case, we cap them off, and we also put an automated water level recorder in there. So it's a self-contained small, about 6-inch long instrument that just sits in the bottom of the well, measures pressure, which is directly related to water depth, and records that every 15 minutes or an hour, however long we program it for. And that gives us a record of how the water level fluctuates in that pipe or piezometer. We placed these in a number of locations, and our goal was to, number one, be able to draw lines across the channel. So here we have a transect. We've got one here, and one here. And so that allows us to relate the water levels across the meadow to see if there's differences. And similarly, we can do transects along the channel. And then the other thing we wanted to do was get a range of different conditions. This is a huge meadow, and there's a lot of sort of ambient background conditions. Some areas more affected by the disturbance than others, some areas that have naturally high groundwater already. And so we wanted to make sure that we got one of these piezometers in each one of these different locations to see how the different areas respond. Similar approach to the middle meadow. We also established stream flow gauging stations, and the way that we measure stream flow is by measuring essentially water velocity in a natural channel at a number of locations across the channel. When the water's low, we can wade across, measure velocity and depth, and that gives us a cross-sectional area of the channel, which allows us to calculate stream flow in cubic feet per second. So we take a number of measurements across the channel, multiply them out, add them up, calculate the area, and that gives us our instantaneous stream flow measurement. We also, at a location, will have a continuous water level recorder in that location near where we're measuring stream flow. So we can record water depth. We can't actually record stream flow, but we can do, just like the piezometers, we can record water depth over time, have a 15-minute record of water depth over time. And if we know at different levels what the stream flow is, then we can generate a relationship between stream flow and water depth, and then apply that to the whole record. So we get a 15-minute record of stream flow for as long as we do it for, in this case, for 10 years. So, and then when the water's low enough, we can just wade across, like in the lower right here. And when the water is too high to wade, we measure velocity by either dropping an instrument off of a bridge with a cable and winch, or we also have a float that we can run across the channel with two people on either bank, and that will measure it for us as well. And then, of course, so we wanted to know how much water is coming into the meadows and how much water is going out. So we set up 6 stream flow gauging stations, and these yellow lines are basically encompassing the watershed area. So each of, wherever, if a drop of water falls anywhere inside this yellow line, it will flow in one of these blue streams and out into the upper meadow on the little Truckee River here, on Parazzo Creek here. So we can add these two together to know how much water is coming in to the upper meadow every 15 minutes. And then below the upper meadow, we can measure how much water is coming out of the upper meadow every 15 minutes. And then same thing for the middle meadow, try to capture as many of the tributaries to that meadow as possible. And then the lower meadow is not labeled here, but that's what these last 2 stream flow gauging stations are about. So I will tell you about some of the things that we've learned along the way. I'll go through this fairly quickly, and you can, of course, feel free to ask me more questions afterwards. Number one, there's a lot of variability in those sub watersheds that I just showed, and so that the physiography or the orientation of the watershed, the shape, the number of tributaries that come together and where they come together matter, and that affects the timing of runoff, which then affects how much water is delivered to the lower meadow or to the meadows and when. So just to give you some data, I want to talk about the Coldstream watershed. So over the whole year, this is from 2012, from May to September during the snowmelt period, we had about 2,500 acre feet of water coming out of Coldstream, this little watershed that we were gauging. And that's not a lot when you compare it to, say, what's coming into the middle meadow from everything else above that. So we have from the upper watersheds about almost 19,000 acre feet of water. And just for context, an acre foot is 1 acre. You know, if you picture 1 foot of water, one water that's 1 foot deep, or a pond that's 1 acre big and 1 foot deep, that would be 1 acre foot of water. And in this case, over this snowmelt period, we had almost 19,000 acre feet pass through the middle meadow from upstream, and only 2,500 acre feet of water delivered from Coldstream. But Coldstream is a canyon. It faces north. It doesn't get a lot of sun until, you know, late in the summer. And it's small and narrow, and it also gets wind loaded by Sierra storms, so it holds a lot of snow for a long time. And now we're gonna look at that flow record. So again, just keep in mind there's something like, you know, 15% of all the water that was delivered to the middle meadow came from Coldstream. Now we're going to look at what that looked like in terms of daily flow in cubic feet per second. So this is a hydrograph showing over time, over that water year, that, you know, and each one of these lines represents those different inputs and output from the middle meadow. So into the middle meadow from upper is the red line. So this is what's coming in from the big watershed into the middle meadow over time. So 10 CFS in March, going up almost to 1,000 CFS during the peak of spring snowmelt, this red line, and then coming back down as the summer continued. Now, and Coldstream now is this blue line on the bottom. It's always less, or almost always less during the winter in terms of stream flow coming into the middle meadow. And even during the peak of snowmelt, it's just a smaller watershed. It can't deliver that much water to the middle meadow. But as the summer goes on, even though it's only like 15% of the watershed, by the time you get into August and September, Coldstream is accounting for almost all of the water that's coming into the middle meadow. So that becomes a really important watershed to focus on in terms of, okay, like how are we going to support these meadows? So we basically learned that late in the summer, Coldstream is really important, even though it's a small watershed. It's important for that late summer base flow, which supports the vegetation, the habitat, and the fish that are in the channel. Again, just pointing out, here's the different colors, and really focusing in on that late part of the year, this little watershed giving all that water to the middle meadow. So that can become a conservation strategy if folks can make sure that disturbance is limited in that area going forward. Okay, another finding, we found that groundwater response to the restoration project is really variable across a meadow, and that depends on like these different meadow types. Remember, I was talking about those different zones that you know, may or may not be as affected by the historical disturbance. So I'll talk here about some different piezometers. Each one of these pink rings is where we had a piezometer, and we're measuring groundwater levels before and during the restoration project. So we have low-lying floodplain areas, we have subsurface low gradient areas, and subsurface means that it was already supported by shallow groundwater. So this is one of those areas that wasn't really affected by the disturbance. And then we have a discharge slope wetland, which is up above the meadow just a little bit, also getting some groundwater support. And now I'll show you similar hydrographs to the ones that we looked at for stream flow, but these are just groundwater levels. So each one of these lines represents, is is a water level over time across the bottom. And these are 3 different years at the same location that we're looking at. So we have the dashed line is before restoration, and this is that low-lying floodplain area that was probably impacted more by the disturbance. So before restoration, the water level was up, 0 being the ground surface, 1 would be 1 foot below the ground surface, or -1 would be 1 foot above the ground surface. It's can be a little confusing sometimes. At any rate, before restoration, you'd have your spring snowmelt period in the April-May timeframe, and then over the course of the summer, as you get into July and August, the groundwater level fell to about 3 feet below the ground surface. As soon as that plug and pond project went in, we saw in our groundwater level record an immediate recovery and an immediate rise in groundwater levels up to near the ground surface, but right into the root zone of those wetland plants. And then the next year, starting with the narrow blue solid line here, this would be the first year after restoration. Water levels stayed high into the fall, and then also stayed high into the summer and higher across the rest of the summer and into the next fall. And again, they never fell down below that root zone as a result of the restoration project. And then water year 12, same thing, water levels stayed high. Water year 11 was a pretty wet year, and water year 12 was a pretty dry year, or near average. And in both of those cases, the water levels stayed fairly high. So that looks like they did achieve their goal. Now I will talk about piezometer 09-6, which is the subsurface low gradient. Already had groundwater levels pretty high before restoration. So again, the dashed blue line is before restoration. And you can see that water levels didn't fall as deep because it had that groundwater support already. Although when that restoration project went in, they did come up. You can still see the signature of when the restoration project went in, but there wasn't that much, there wasn't that much room for the water to get much higher. So we saw only maybe a half a foot rise as a result of the restoration project. And then in years 2 and 3, the water levels, of course, stayed high still. And then there's 09-11, which is an area that's a little bit above the meadow, also gets a little bit of groundwater support. In 09-11, we didn't see much effect at all from the restoration project. Before the project, the dashed blue line shows the water levels falling over the course of the summer and into the fall. And then you can't even detect really when the restoration project went in. And this is probably just because, like I said, it's just a little bit higher than the rest of the meadow. It still has pretty good groundwater support. Water levels are typically only 2 feet down versus like the 3 or 4 feet down that we see in some other areas. But the restoration project really didn't seem to affect this area at all. So again, it's highly variable. Another finding, we were able to calculate how much water was retained in the meadow, back to that whole concept of, can we restore meadows? That underlying question of, can we restore meadows and hold a lot of water in them to help support water supply in California or Nevada, and then support low flows for habitat at the same time later into the year. We did see that water retention and slow release appears to result from this kind of restoration project. Initially, we saw the water retention. Bear with me, another hydrograph here. Now we're back to looking at stream flow in cubic feet per second. And this is just the middle meadow. So the outflow coming from the middle meadow before restoration is what we looked at before. Pretty typical rises in the over the course of the winter into the spring, peaking during snowmelt in the spring, and then falling. As soon as the restoration project went in, we saw a lot of that water being held back. So the flow rate out of the middle meadow fell dramatically as soon as the restoration project happened. And it went almost, well, in some cases to zero, as all that water was held back in the ponds and got into the soil. What we did was estimated, well, what if we estimated what this hydrograph should look like if that water wasn't held back? And then for each of these 15-minute periods, we said, okay, well, here's the amount of water that would have flowed out of the meadow over that 15-minute period, what was actually flowing out of the meadow over that 15-minute period. And the difference in that volume of water is how much water was stored in the meadow as a result of building those plugs and ponds. And what we calculated from that subtraction, essentially the area underneath between these two lines out here, what we calculated was that was about 110 acre feet of water in the meadow. And what that across that whole meadow area, what that equates to is about around a half or 0.6 acre feet per acre of meadow restored. So this is kind of exciting because this gives us an actual number. If somebody wants to put a value on how much money did they spend on this project and how much water did they store in the meadow as a result, this kind of quantification gave them an opportunity to quantify and document that. So just a little bit more visually put, what am I talking about? When they created these ponds and diverted water into this whole area inside the red circle, we basically saw that area fill up with water. And this is a slightly different zone, but the concept is the same. So what I'm saying is something like a half an acre foot for each acre within that red area is what they got out of doing this project. There's these two yellow dots are two piezometers that we had in that area later on. And I'm going to show some data from one of these piezometers, I think. There we go. So this is the hydrograph from one of those piezometers. And what we saw was that, the reason I'm showing you this is because what we saw is that, so there's the question of, okay, you store that water in the meadow, does it actually get released to downstream? And the answer is in some years, yes, in some years, no. This year, 2012, that I'm showing here, we saw that water that was stored in that red area I showed you on the previous slide actually did get released to a downstream area, but much later than it had, prior to restoration. So we see this water level stabilizing in that area, and then when the flow drops low enough, that area drained. So initially, water was held up in the root zone and then delayed, and then the water drained from that red area later in the year. How much water? About 2.5 feet of water level, and what that equates to is in that red area is a 77 acre area. So we just did rough calculations to say, okay, like what does that look like in terms of flow? And we assume that there's about 30% of the soil is open space that can take the water. And we calculated that water level fell over about 69 days and gave us, so when you do the math on that, It's 2.5 feet over about 77 acres, but divided by about a third over that time frame, we get about 0.84 acre feet per day. And then just doing basic conversion factors, we see that that's about a half or 0.42 cubic feet per second. And lo and behold, we did see, you remember when I was looking at the importance of cold stream, that base flow in the late summer was about 1 CFS. So what we're seeing here is about almost a half a CFS of water that's delivered to downstream areas later in the summer. And then finally, I hope I'm not going too long. I'm assuming that Leah will tell me if I do go too long. But this is the last finding I'm going to show here. And now we're about 10 years in. And a lot of what I just showed you was from the first few years of monitoring right after the project was done. So we're, looking at some areas and saying, oh yeah, this worked out great. This, and in other areas, maybe not. But by watching the system for 10 years, we've learned that the system evolves a little bit, and some of that early work, early results that we saw are sort of balanced out after the system evolves. And in particular, the channel evolves, erodes a little bit again. And so remember, this is what it looked like immediately after restoration, about 10 years. Oh, and then during a flood shortly after restoration. And then, about 10 years in, still looks really good in the spring. And now this is from 2019, about 9 years later. It still looks really good in the spring, water everywhere in all the Relic Channels. But you get into the summer and you look in this same area, and you can see there's a side channel, that they said, right after the project was finished, looked really good. Water was kicked into that channel. Well, as we got, over 10 years, we got some pretty high flows. Some things moved around, and water levels and the channel, that old channel, eroded out a little bit, which is, to be expected, natural process of channel evolution. But then you look at the record, or groundwater level record, this blue line over 10 years reflects the groundwater level over that 10-year time frame in that same piezometer 099 that I was showing you earlier, where we saw some of the initial rises right upon the restoration. We've seen that year after year, and especially after some big storms like we had in 2017, that channel scoured out, and we're seeing that water levels in some of those meadow areas that responded so rapidly are now again falling to not quite pre-restoration conditions, but you're getting maybe a third or a half of the result that we saw in the years. So I guess the takeaway from that is that it's we can really learn a lot by watching these systems for a long time. And I'll just say a thank you to the folks who have been allowing me and my company Balance to look at this system and learn from it over the years here. Like I said, the Tahoe National Forest and the Truckee River Watershed Council in particular have been regularly seeking funding from state grant opportunities and from the state of California to support this work and the learning process. So with that, I will I'll stop and turn it back over to Leah.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for sharing your work with us.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I hope I didn't go too long there.
No, not at all. That was perfect. It was really great to hear kind of the preliminary, what you found before your project, and then to hear all the way through to 10 years later. It's pretty incredible to see how things changed. So we're going to open it up to some questions here. And while they're coming in, kind of starting with where you left off, I wondered, is it typical to see these changes happen over time and do you sometimes go back and sort of redo or aid that original restoration project to steer things back to the way they were when you first did the restoration?
Yeah, that's funny you mentioned that, because just on Sunday I was out just kind of helping things along a little bit. Sometimes you have to go in with heavy equipment if you have the ability to do that. And in this case, the Truckee River Watershed Council has all sorts of volunteer opportunities, and over the years we have been going in with volunteers and bolstering up some of these areas and trying to slow down some of the channel evolution, trying to emulate beavers and what they do, because that once the water is spread out, that's what they want. They try to keep it that way, and so we go in sometimes just by hand and plant more willows in certain areas and put debris in the channels, like the trees and branches, to try to slow the water down. And so yeah, is that what you were asking?
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds like there's some continued maintenance over time.
Yeah, and people sometimes call that adaptive management. As you watch, you manage, and so you adapt to the the conditions that you see out there. So there's a lot of literature and a lot of people kind of thinking about how we approach these types of projects. And I like to think that the science of restoration, or the practice of restoration, really should be looked at more as like stewardship. I mean, sometimes you go in and you do something very big scale, but then the way that people have been working in the landscape kind of forever is to have an ongoing interaction with it. And whether we call it adaptive management or stewardship, I think that really is just appropriate. You can't necessarily expect you just go in, like building a bridge. You don't just go in and do it and walk away. You got to keep an eye on it and maintain it.
Right. And so speaking of change over time and continued maintenance, we have a very fitting question here from Spencer. So how does someone in your position take the predicted impacts of climate change, like more droughts or more extreme weather events, into account when you're formulating a restoration project?
That's a good question. A project of this nature is just by definition, it's designed to be resilient to drought. One of the findings that I didn't present here is that we are seeing these meadows during the drought years, looking at satellite imagery, stay greener through drought periods after they've had these restoration projects. So they become more resilient to drought by taking this approach and keeping the water spread out and stored in the ground. They also become more resilient to high flows that you would have, from bigger storms, because the water is no longer confined to a single channel and further eroding the meadow. By trying to spread the water out, it is just sort of inherently a design for resiliency. There are other types of approaches that people take to restoring degraded meadows that involve more like engineering type of approaches, where you might not have a whole meadow where you can just spill water out across the floodplain, and where they have to basically calculate, build structures like the way you would build a bridge to be able to stand up to the 100-year flow. And the way folks might approach that is similar to how you might approach designing a bridge. You say, well, we think the flows are going to be more frequent and higher going forward, so we're going to build it to withstand an even higher flow under climate change. But by trying to emulate nature and taking this plug and pond type of approach, or similar spreading the water out type of approach, it is just by design more resilient.
Interesting. It's interesting that you're able to account for that and that they stay greener. Really, really cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you clarify for us? I know that a lot of groundwater is held in meadows, but it might seem to people like most of the water is going to be in a stream or in a river. So why does restoring the groundwater in a meadow positively impact the whole system?
Well, it's essentially a positive feedback loop. By getting the water out onto, so it's really about floodplains and floodplain restoration. A lot of the streams that are in rivers are no longer able to get to their floodplains. In this case, it's a meadow, but it could be the same thing like in California's Central Valley, where there's levees now. And so by getting water back onto there's a lot of functions of floodplains and a lot of value in having water get out onto floodplain surfaces. I talked a little bit about the nutrient uptake that you can get, and so that takes nutrients out of the water. You get less algae, you get less production in the water, and essentially cleans the water, filters out sediment. So whether it's going into a reservoir or whether it's just choking out fish, you can get sediment out of the water by spreading it out on the floodplain, dropping the velocities, and you can rebuild farmland with that sediment too. So there are, like in the Central Valley, controlled ways to get water out onto farms and fields to for rice farmers, for example, and get that floodplain function back. So it's kind of just trying to get the system back to its to where it started. And some of these things we can't quantify or predict. And I believe that by taking the approach of trying to figure out what was there and doing our best to create either the form or the process that was there before it was impacted, the ecosystem will respond, and then that will just cascade through all sorts, the whole communities, all the species that are there, the habitat that's been lost, and the water quality improvements that we could get.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the scientists that we interview are doing sort of conservation or restoration projects, and I ask this a lot for the people watching who feel really dedicated to helping the cause. What can someone who's not a hydrologist do to help support their local waterways?
There are probably, I would guess that on most streams in California, there's a local watershed group, friends of your local creek. Here we've got also like Friends of Squaw Creek, and then so there's volunteer opportunities, like I was talking about, to go just get. I had my 11 and 14-year-old kids out with me working on this project. It's not it's not rocket science. It's not science. It's just a matter of getting out and whether it's pulling weeds that have invaded or building analog beaver dams and helping the beavers out, or just education. There's a lot of educational opportunities in raising awareness for watersheds by hooking up with one of the local groups and helping them with educational materials. Or just trash cleanup days and that sort of thing as well. I think raising awareness and even just knowing some of the basics of how a watershed works, what is a watershed, and where does the water go when we spray down our driveway or water our lawn. Thinking about the hydrologic cycle and just being aware of that and paying attention to that, I think can help as well.
Absolutely, especially important in California.
Yeah.
Well, David, thank you so much for sharing your research with us, for connecting with our audience and leaving us with something that we can do as well for our communities. We really appreciate having you, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks. This was fun. Thanks for having me. And you have a good day too.